Hello everyone, welcome to our channel. Today, we are going to dive into the life of one of the most feared and fascinating rulers in history, Ivan the Terrible. But before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. It helps us continue bringing you amazing content. Now tell me, can absolute power turn someone into a monster? Ivan IV of Russia, better known as Ivan the Terrible, was a man of extremes. He unified Russia, expanded territories, and consolidated the country as a great power. But at the same time, he plunged into a spiral of violence, paranoia, and terror, even killing those closest to him. Why did Ivan become so cruel? Did his childhood play a role in this? What were the most significant moments of his reign? And how did his brutality impact Russia? Get ready because today's story is intense. Let's begin. Ivan IV was born on August 25, 1530, the son of the Grand Prince of Moscow, Vasily III, and his wife, Elena Glinskaya. From an early age, his life was marked by tragedy and intrigue. At 3 years old, Ivan lost his father, becoming Grand Prince while still a child. His mother, Elena, took over as regent, but her leadership was short-lived. 5 years later, she died under suspicious circumstances, possibly poisoned by the boyars, the Russian aristocracy who saw their power threatened. With his mother's death, Ivan and his brother were left at the mercy of the boyars, who fought for control of the throne. Throughout his childhood and adolescence, Ivan lived in an environment of violence and abuse. He was often neglected, mistreated, and witnessed murders and betrayals within the palace. This hostile environment shaped his personality, making him distrustful and vengeful. At 13 years old, Ivan made his first major political decision. In a display of power, he ordered the execution of one of the most influential boyars, Andrei Shuisky, marking the beginning of his rise to absolute power. At 16, in 1547, Ivan became the first Russian ruler to proclaim himself Tsar of all Rus, a title that distinguished him from the previous grand princes and reinforced his authority over the entire nation. Ivan's coronation not only symbolized the centralization of power in Moscow but also inaugurated a new era in Russian history. With a mix of grand vision and past traumas, Ivan began his reign with a series of reforms aimed at strengthening the state and ensuring his supremacy over the nobility. With Ivan IV's coronation in 1547, Russia officially entered the era of the Tsars. Ivan did not want to be just a ruler but rather an absolute monarch, inspired by Byzantine emperors and ancient Roman Caesars. He believed his authority came directly from God, granting him unquestionable power over his subjects. In the early years of his reign, Ivan sought to implement reforms that strengthened the state. He reorganized the administration, created a stricter legal code called the Sudebnik of 1550, and reformed the military by introducing an elite force known as the Streltsy. Additionally, he promoted trade and encouraged economic development. In 1551, Ivan convened the Council of the Hundred Chapters, an assembly that reformed the Russian Orthodox Church and reinforced the Tsar's role as Russia's supreme leader. This close relationship between church and state further solidified his power. However, the young Tsar also faced challenges. In 1547, Moscow was devastated by a massive fire that destroyed part of the city and sparked popular revolts. Many blamed corrupt boyars, but the public dissatisfaction made Ivan realize that he needed to reduce the aristocracy's influence to rule more securely. Ivan's response was to create the Zemsky Sobor, a consultative assembly composed of representatives from different social classes. Although the Tsar retained the final say, this measure gave him popular support against the boyars. This initial phase of Ivan's reign was marked by attempts to modernize and consolidate the Russian state. However, as challenges grew and his distrust deepened, the Tsar began transforming into an increasingly paranoid and cruel ruler, ushering in one of the darkest periods in Russian history. At the height of his power, Ivan IV not only consolidated internal governance but also launched ambitious military campaigns to expand Russia's borders. His goal was to strengthen the country and make it a power comparable to the great European kingdoms. During his reign, Russia doubled in size, incorporating vast regions and gaining greater geopolitical influence. The first major conquest came in 1552 with the capture of the Khanate of Kazan, a Tatar state that had long been a constant threat to Moscow. For this campaign, Ivan prepared a powerful army and introduced military innovations, such as extensive use of heavy artillery. The siege lasted weeks, and the Russian victory was brutal. Thousands of inhabitants were massacred, and the city was integrated into the Tsar's domain. This conquest not only secured the central regions of Russia but also paved the way for further expansion. In 1556, Ivan turned his attention to the Khanate of Astrakhan, another strategic Tatar kingdom located at the mouth of the Volga River. The victory was swift and decisive, allowing Russia to control the entire Volga, one of Eurasia's most important commercial routes. With these two conquests, Ivan eliminated much of the Mongol Tatar influence in the region and solidified his position as the supreme leader. After these victories in the east, Ivan turned westward, seeking to expand Russia to the Baltic Sea to access maritime trade routes. In 1558, he initiated the Livonian War, a conflict against the Livonian Order, Poland, Lithuania, and Sweden. Initially, the Russians secured significant victories and captured several fortresses in the region. However, the war soon turned disastrous. The resistance of the adversaries intensified, the Russian economy became overburdened, and the prolonged conflict led to internal discontent. The war, which lasted until 1583, exhausted Russia and ended in defeat. Ivan was forced to sign a peace treaty, renouncing his ambitions in the Baltic and losing territories to Sweden. The conflict drained the country's resources and contributed to the Tsar's increasing paranoia, which, frustrated by the failure, further intensified his internal repression. Despite the hardships, the conquest of Kazan and Astrakhan solidified the Russian Empire and paved the way for future expansions. Ivan IV laid the foundations for Russia to become a vast Eurasian empire, though the cost of his campaigns was high for the Russian people. Determined to expand Russia's borders, Ivan launched a series of military campaigns that transformed the country into a territorial power. He conquered the Khanate of Kazan 1552 and the Khanate of Astrakhan 1556, securing control over the Volga River and eliminating Tatar influence. However, the Livonian War 1558-1583 against Poland, Sweden, and Lithuania drained Russian resources and weakened his rule. The early years of Ivan IV's reign were marked by reforms and expansions, but the death of his wife, Anastasia Romanovna, in 1560, triggered a dark shift in his personality. Anastasia was considered a stabilizing influence on Ivan, and her sudden death, possibly by poisoning, deepened his paranoia. The Tsar became convinced that his internal enemies, mainly the boyars, were conspiring against him. From that moment, Ivan became increasingly cruel and unstable. His distrust of the nobility led him to sever any attempts at diplomacy and rule with an iron fist. He believed that only a regime of terror could secure his authority and eliminate opposition. In 1565, Ivan made a drastic decision. He created the Oprichnina, a parallel government system that divided Russia into two parts. One part, the Zemshina, remained under the control of the traditional nobles, while the other, the Oprichnina, was governed directly by the Tsar and managed by his feared secret police, the Oprichniki. The Oprichniki were soldiers loyal only to Ivan. They dressed in black and rode with dogs tied to their saddles, a symbol that they were sniffing out treason. They were granted unlimited power to investigate, torture, and execute anyone suspected of conspiracy. The violence spread quickly. Nobles were stripped of their lands, priests were murdered for not supporting Ivan, and entire cities were decimated. The height of brutality occurred in 1570, during the massacre of Novgorod. Convinced that the city was plotting betrayal and seeking an alliance with the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, Ivan sent his Oprichniki to punish the population. For weeks, thousands of inhabitants were brutally tortured and killed, including women and children. The city, one of Russia's main commercial centers, was left in ruins. Ivan's transformation into the terrible was complete. He was no longer just an authoritarian leader but a feared and unpredictable monarch, ruling under a reign of terror that terrified both the nobility and the common people. However, this spiral of violence was far from over. As his paranoia grew, Ivan IV intensified his actions against those he considered enemies of the state. In 1565, he established the Oprichnina, a system of governance that divided Russia into two parts, the Zemshina, governed by traditional boyars, and the Oprichnina, under the direct control of the Tsar. This new administrative structure gave Ivan absolute power over a significant portion of Russian territory, allowing him to rule without interference from the aristocracy. The Oprichnina was accompanied by the creation of a feared secret police force, the Oprichniki. They were personally chosen by Ivan and known for their blind loyalty and brutal tactics. Dressed in black and riding horses that carried dog heads tied to their saddles, a symbol of their mission to sniff out treason, the Oprichniki spread terror throughout Russia. The attacks began with the boyars, whom Ivan saw as his main enemies. Thousands of nobles were stripped of their lands, imprisoned, tortured, and executed under accusations of treason, often without any concrete evidence. Their properties were confiscated and redistributed to followers loyal to the Tsar. Over time, the brutality of the Oprichnina extended beyond the nobility. Entire cities suffered under repression. The most notorious episode occurred in 1570, with the massacre of Novgorod. Convinced that the city's inhabitants were conspiring to align with the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, Ivan ordered a devastating attack. For weeks, the Oprichniki tortured and executed thousands of people, including women, children, and clergy. The city, a major commercial hub of Russia, was left in ruins. However, the Oprichnina soon turned against its own members. With no clear enemies left, they began acting uncontrollably, plundering villages and enriching themselves at the expense of the population. The Russian economy collapsed due to the systematic destruction of agricultural lands and the mass exodus of people seeking safety. In 1572, Ivan decided to officially abolish the Oprichnina. The experiment had failed. Instead of strengthening Russia, it left the country weaker and more vulnerable. But the damage was already done. The terror imposed by the Oprichniki shattered the trust between the Tsar and his subjects, and Russia's economy took years to recover from the consequences of this brutal regime. Ivan's reign would never be the same again. The most tragic and symbolic event of Ivan IV's reign occurred in 1581 when, in a fit of rage, he fatally struck his own son and heir, Ivan Ivanovich. The conflict reportedly began when the Tsar reprimanded his son's wife for wearing what he deemed inappropriate clothing. Outraged, Ivan Ivanovich confronted his father, and the argument quickly escalated. In his fury, Ivan IV struck his son on the head with his iron staff, inflicting a severe wound. The Tsarevich agonized for days before succumbing to his injuries, while Ivan, devastated, pleaded for his recovery. Accounts suggest that the Tsar was overwhelmed with guilt, crying over his son's body. This act destroyed the direct line of succession and plunged Russia into a period of instability known as the Time of Troubles, a phase of political and dynastic crises. The impact of this event was so profound that, centuries later, it was immortalized in one of Russia's most famous paintings, Ivan the Terrible and His Son Ivan on November 16, 1581, by Ilya Repin. The artwork, completed in 1885, portrays a horrified Ivan holding his son in his arms, consumed by regret. The dramatic intensity and vivid colors emphasize the tragedy and madness that dominated Ivan's later years. This episode not only symbolized Ivan IV's personal decline but also sealed Russia's fate. Without a strong heir, the country entered a period of chaos and throne disputes. In his final years, Ivan IV was physically debilitated and mentally unstable. His government had plunged Russia into economic and social crisis, and his son's death only deepened his isolation and paranoia. The Tsar increasingly relied on astrologers, alchemists, and healers in search of a remedy for his deterioration. On March 18, 1584, Ivan died while playing chess. Reports indicate that he collapsed suddenly and did not survive. Some theories suggest he was poisoned, while others claim his health had already been severely compromised by diseases such as syphilis and arthritis. His successor, his younger son Fyodor I, was weak and inexperienced, leading Russia into the time of troubles. Without a strong heir, the country faced succession crises and foreign invasions, threatening the survival of the Rurik dynasty. Ivan IV's legacy remains controversial. For some, he was a visionary monarch who strengthened Russia and expanded its borders. For others, he was a cruel tyrant whose paranoia and brutality left the country devastated. Regardless, his image endures in history and culture, a ruler both feared and admired. And that concludes the story of Ivan the Terrible. What do you think about this controversial czar? Was he a visionary or a tyrant? Leave your comment below and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more fascinating historical stories.